Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 42 of Contemplating Life. This week I'll continue with more stories of my many years of volunteer ministry for St. Gabriel Catholic Church. This week we discuss the challenge of adjusting to a new pastor and my experience of what I believe was a miracle. Standard disclaimers: I'm not trying to evangelize or preach to anyone. I'm just telling my stories. Also, this is my best recollection of events from over 20 years ago. I may have some of the details wrong or out of sequence, but this is what I remember the way I remember it. After serving for 8 years on the Finance Committee, I transitioned to other ministries. I believe I was briefly on the Board of Education. They not only covered the management of the school, but also the CCD Sunday School program, as well as the RCIA inquiry classes and other adult education programs. Naturally, my interest was in RCIA, which I taught, and adult education. But the biggest transition after leaving the Finance Committee was that we had a new pastor. A relatively young priest named Father Bill Marks was assigned to St. Gabriel. He was a tall, blond, handsome man who somewhat resembled a young Robert Redford. Now let me talk about clergy assignments for a moment. Earlier in my Faith series of episodes, I talked about getting private tutorship from Father Paul Rehart at St. Christopher Parish when I was about 6 years old. He was the youngest of 3 priests assigned to that parish. And while having 3 clergy in one parish was rare, the standard was clearly 2. There would be an experienced priest assigned as a pastor, and a young, perhaps newly ordained priest as an associate pastor. One typically did not get to be a pastor until they had served considerable time as an associate, sort of on-the-job training. As I was growing up in St. Gabriel, we always had 2 priests, and when I returned to the church in my late 20s, we also had 2 then. Father Paul Landwerlin was the pastor, and Father Conrad Cameron was associate. Father Conrad was eventually moved and assigned as a pastor of another parish, but I don't remember which one. Maybe St. Anne? I forget. Anyway, after he left, we had Monsignor Fred Easton, who lived at our parish rectory and celebrated Mass with us. But his regular job throughout the week was the judicial vicar of the Archdiocese, the 3rd highest position in the Archdiocese. He didn't have any other duties at our parish except to celebrate sacraments on the weekends. The Catholic Church as a whole is suffering from a severe lack of new priests, so the days when you could have 2 or 3 per parish are long gone. These days, one priest might have to serve multiple parishes. As our story approaches the turn of the century, that shortage is just beginning to be felt. Father Bill Marks had only served briefly as an associate pastor before being assigned full pastor at St. Gabriel. Having him assigned here as a pastor so early in his career was quite unusual. Having listened to Father Paul Landwerlin preach for a decade, I was looking forward to someone with a new perspective. I got something new, all right, but it wasn't anything I could use. Father Bill would tell stories we knew could not have happened to him, but he would tell them as if he was the originator of the story. He would say something like, "I was on a flight to Chicago this week to visit my family, and then he would describe an encounter with a famous person. The likelihood that he would encounter such a person on a flight from India to Chicago was near 0. I've heard that there are magazines that clergy can subscribe to. They contain articles and anecdotes that you can use for a homily. But the idea behind it is you're supposed to stand up there and say, 'I read this article with an inspiring story I'm going to relate to you.' But instead, he was taking these articles and making himself the center of the story. Sometimes he'd tell an old joke that I'd heard many times before, But rather than say, "Did you hear the one about the guy?" Again, he would tell the story as if it had actually happened to him. And there were other instances in which his duplicitous nature caused me a lot of trouble. In addition to our weekly bulletin that was printed and distributed after Mass each Sunday, we also had a monthly newsletter. It contained feature articles about the activities in the parish. Sometimes it was a thank you article from a parishioner whose spiritual needs had been met, perhaps during the loss of a loved one or an extended illness, in which parishioners helped one another out. There was a woman who came to my RCI class who converted to Catholicism, and she wanted to get involved in the parish. She went to Father Bill and said that she would like to be the editor of the monthly newsletter. He suggested she form a small working committee and come up with a proposal on how to revamp the newsletter and make it more useful. She put countless hours into that committee, putting together a proposal. Just before she was ready to present it to him, I had a conversation with him and learned that he was going to cancel the monthly newsletter altogether. I later ran into the woman and said something like, "Well, I guess your newsletter ideas didn't go anywhere. Sorry to hear about that." She said, "What?" I told her the newsletter was being shut down. She was furious. She had not yet presented her proposal to Father Bill. She was livid that her work was for nothing and was dead on arrival. She ended up leaving St. Gabriel, and I don't know, but I think she may have left the Catholic Church completely. There were also major changes he made in the staff. Many of them affected my friend Judy, who was the parish secretary and bookkeeper. Under Father Paul, Judy had a great deal of responsibility. In any other parish, I think someone with her responsibilities would have had the title business manager, which many parishes had. For example, St. Monica Parish had a man named Jim Welter, who I greatly admired. His title was business manager and pastoral associate. A pastoral associate is someone who is not a priest, but deals with many of the spiritual needs of the parish. It's the kind of thing that an associate pastor used to do when we could have more than one priest. Our pastoral associate was Sister Timothy Kavanaugh. I think that the titles business manager and pastoral associate could have fit Judy, considering the work she was doing. I had been disappointed that Father Paul had not given her a title that more closely reflected what she was doing. So when Father Bill arrived, he was offended that a lowly secretary was running the parish. The clashes between Judy and this new inexperienced pastor are not mine to tell. I only mention these things here because they so deeply affected me. It hurt me personally that someone who had dedicated so much of her life, above and beyond her job description, to work for the parish was being so devalued. She eventually resigned and took a position as an administrative assistant at the Church Federation of Greater Indianapolis. I continued to work with her as her favorite computer consultant for several years in that position. Judy wasn't the only staff person who was driven out. We had a part-time staff person named Joan, who served as youth ministry coordinator. Father Bill redefined her job description in such a way that the position now required a college degree. She didn't have one, so it was his backdoor way of firing her. When she filed for unemployment, he contested it in court. He said she was free to apply for the new position, of course ignoring the fact that he knew she wasn't qualified under his new standards. He went into court with his priestly collar on and testified that he didn't fire her, and therefore she didn't deserve unemployment. The judge practically laughed in his face and ruled against him. When a man of his position testifies under oath to something with his hand on the Bible, and the judge rules against him, It says a lot about the kind of person he is. The obvious fabrications from the pulpit, his disrespect for the staff, his disrespect for volunteers, all created an atmosphere where it was impossible for me to respect anything that he said or to receive any sort of spiritual direction from him. All of the incidents I described, and others that I haven't described, affected other people. They were people I cared about, but it really didn't affect me directly. I kept telling myself he hadn't done anything to me personally, so I shouldn't react too strongly. But it was becoming more and more difficult to stay involved in the parish that I loved. It came time for the parish to buy a new personal computer. I consulted with him and others on what they should purchase. I don't recall the exact details of a controversy that arose around that purchase, but it all boiled down to the question, had the computer been ordered or not? I was told that it had been, and had made major preparations to get it set up and configured. I think we were in some sort of a time crunch. Again, I don't remember all of the details, but I remember having to make a lot of arrangements that turned out to be unnecessary because the new machine had not yet been ordered. When I confronted him about it, he argued over the sentence, "It has been ordered." He argued over the meaning of the word has, which reminded me of Bill Clinton. Clinton made a statement under oath during a deposition in a sexual harassment civil trial that came out in public after the Lewinsky scandal. Clinton famously said, quote, "It depends on what your definition of the word is, end quote. Clinton was so duplicitous and chose his words so carefully that he could argue over the meaning of the word is. The idea that my pastor, a man of the cloth, an ordained priest of God in the Holy Roman Catholic Church, could be a deceptive, manipulative bender of words similar to William Jefferson Clinton completely destroyed any hope that I could work with the man in the future. At one point, I tried repeatedly to get an appointment with him to discuss some church business, and he kept blowing me off. When I finally did get to sit down with him, he admitted he was avoiding me because he knew how disgruntled I'd become. I told him he was making value judgments. I did have important things to discuss with him. Then after I discussed with him what I really wanted to talk about, I did give him an earful. I told him I was done working in any administrative capacity for the parish because I couldn't deal with him. I told him I couldn't keep up with his lies and cover for him when he got caught. The only way for me to avoid that was to avoid having to deal with him at all. Then I wouldn't have to worry about whether or not something he told me was going to burst someone's bubble and drive them away from the church when they discovered they couldn't trust the priest. I did spend some time crunching budget numbers for the school because the principal there, a wonderful woman named Barbara Shuey, knew my skills as a number cruncher and respected me. I could work with her and not have to deal with Father Bill. I did continue to keep teaching RCIA because it meant I didn't have to deal with Father Bill directly. Oh, by the way, Father Paul used to teach all but about 8 weeks of the classes throughout the year. RCIA was a very high priority for him. I would teach 4 or 5 lessons. A retired history professor from our parish would do 2 weeks on church history, and Sister Timothy would do a lesson on prayer. But Father Paul would do nearly 20 lessons per year to fill out the course. In contrast, we were lucky to get Father Bill to teach 4 or 5 lessons all year. It just wasn't his priority. So I could continue to teach and do nothing else for the church and avoid having to deal with him directly. I would go to Mass on Sunday and sit through his lies from the pulpit and hate every minute of it. I seriously considered moving to a different parish. St. Christopher in Speedway and St. Michael's over on 30th Street are not much farther away from my house than St. Gabriel's. The problem was I attended Mass with my mother. And although she was aware of everything that was going on and was disturbed by it, I don't believe she would have wanted to change parishes. As upset as she was about the situation, she was in a place where I had been, and that he hadn't done anything to her personally. Both my mother and I were devoted to the church and our parish. It wasn't like we had to be good friends with the pastor, as we had been with Father Paul. But there are limits to what we can tolerate. I also had to consider what kind of message it would send to my students if I wasn't attending Mass at St. Gabriel. Here I am saying, come join this church, but I can't stand being here, so I'm going elsewhere. I didn't know if there would be a teaching opportunity for me at St. Christopher or St. Michael's. As I was in the middle of wrestling with all of this, we had an outside guest speaker come to RCIA one evening. It was a nun from the Sisters of Providence at St. Mary of the Woods. They're an order of religious sisters near Terre Haute, Indiana, about 70 miles west of Indianapolis. Their special ministry was teaching. They had been providing teachers to Catholic schools around central Indiana for over a century. They founded and ran St. Mary of the Woods College. It was an all-girls institution, again focused on training educators, whether they were vowed religious sisters or not. I had attended a couple of weekend seminars there. It was a really nice facility. I have fond memories of the place. The guest lecturer, I'm sorry I forget her name, was giving a talk about the founder of the order, Mother Theodore Guerin, who had recently been beatified by Pope John Paul II. This is the final step before becoming canonized as an official saint of the Catholic Church. The speaker was a nun who was in charge of the program to get their matriarch declared a saint. Mother Guerin was born Anna Therese Guerin in France in 1798. She entered the convent in 1823 and took the name Sister St. Theodore. In 1840, at the request of the Bishop of Vincennes, Indiana, a group of sisters from France, led by Sister Theodore, came to Vincennes to found a school and a convent to assist with the influx of Catholic immigrants to the area. In those days, Vincennes was the capital of Indiana. This was before the founding of Indianapolis and its establishment as the state capital. They arrived in a small village near Terre Haute, known as St. Mary of the Woods, and in a small log cabin founded a convent and a girls' school that later grew into the institution it is today. Sister Theodore was their mother superior. Now, apparently this Mother Guerin was quite a character. She was known to hang out in town and engage in intellectual debates with the movers and shakers of the community, discussing religion, politics, philosophy, or whatever topic, and she could hold her own with the best of them. Although she was there at the invitation of the bishop, he tried to micromanage her and interfere in the way she ran the convent and the school. One time she returned to France briefly on a fundraising mission, and he tried to hold an election in her absence to have her replaced as Mother Superior. She was unanimously elected to retain the post by her community. At one point, she was so upset with the interference from the bishop that she wrote a letter to the Bishop of Detroit and asked if he would sponsor their move to his area. He wrote back rejecting the request and told her to stay faithful and that God would provide. After that, the Bishop of Vincennes never interfered with her again. Probably the Detroit bishop wrote him a nasty letter saying to stay the hell out of this woman's way and let her run her convent, or you're going to end up losing him altogether. Mother Theodore Guerin died in 1856 at the age of 57. Under the rules of the Church, one cannot be considered for sainthood until 50 years after their death, although there have been some exceptions made. In 1907, a process was begun to have Mother Guerin considered for canonization as a saint. Now, to be declared a saint, one has to have 2 miracles attributed to them. The first was in 1908. One of the sisters in her community had breast cancer and other medical issues, including a painful abdominal tumor and a neurological problem that affected the use of her arms. One evening, she prayed at the crypt of Mother Theodore Guerin, not for herself, but for another sister who was ill. The next day, she regained the use of her arms, and her abdominal pain disappeared. The cancer never spread, and she lived into her 80s. They never said what happened to the woman she was actually praying for. Let's hope she recovered as well. Now, once you have one miracle attributed to you, you can be beatified, which is a step along the way to becoming a saint. The sister who visited us talked about going to Rome for the beatification ceremony and how beautiful it was. After beatification, you earn the title Blessed. She was now Blessed Mother Theodore Guerin. I was really inspired by the story of this amazing woman who dedicated her life to God and to education. She also had clashes with clergy that nearly drove her away from her ministry as a teacher. I could identify with that. My primary ministry for the church was a teacher, and I was worried by my troublesome clergy, who was going to make it impossible for me to continue that ministry, just as that had happened with Mother Guerin. I considered leaving the way she considered leaving. That night, after hearing the nun talk about Mother Guerin, I went home and I prayed. Blessed Mother Theodore Guerin, you know what it's like to try to teach the Word of God under the authority of a troublesome member of the clergy. Yet you persisted and succeeded. Mother Theodore, give me the strength to endure this challenge, the way that you endured your challenges. The following week, it was my turn to teach. And throughout the lesson, I kept thinking this might be the last time I would teach for St. Gabriel. And perhaps the last time I would teach forever if I couldn't find a position in another parish. When I returned home from class that night, my mom had a huge smile on her face. She said, I got some juicy gossip for you. Well, what is it? Father Paul heard that they're moving Father Bill to a new parish. He'll be leaving in just a few months. Thank you, Blessed Mother Theodore Guerin. All I asked for was the strength to endure. I never would have had the gall to pray that she'd get rid of the man altogether. But that prayer was answered. He was leaving my life for good, and I could continue to serve my parish as I had been doing for many years. I don't recall exactly how long Father Bill was assigned to our parish, but I think it was under 2 years. We would be getting a new pastor with new challenges, and like all the priests in my life, we had some serious disagreements. But things were much, much better after that. Overall, I taught RCIA classes for 31 straight years at St. Gabriel. I wrote a letter to that sister from St. Mary of the Woods who had come to our parish to tell us about Blessed Mother Theodore Guerin. I told her how untenable things had become under my pastor, and how I'd prayed to Mother Guerin, not for a solution to my problem, but for the strength to endure it. And then I told her that my troublesome pastor was leaving. I said I didn't know if that was the kind of thing that would count as the second miracle to get her matriarch canonized, but I had no doubts that I had my own personal miracle through the intercession of Blessed Mother Theodore Guerin. The cause for her canonization eventually succeeded. The second miracle attributed to her occurred in January 2001, when a maintenance man who worked at the college wandered into the chapel, attracted by the sacred music. He was suffering from an eye condition that was going to require surgery. He prayed at the crypt of Mother Guerin and awoke the next day to find that his vision was much clearer. He no longer needed complicated eye surgery, and doctors were at a loss to explain how his condition resolved itself. She was canonized as Saint Theodora Guerin in 2006, and at the time was only the third American saint. Father Bill was assigned to a brand new parish in southeastern Indiana, just across the border from Cincinnati. I pray from time to time that he's doing well and is growing in his experience as a priest and a pastor. Now, I could continue to talk about my work under our next pastor, but I think it's time to take a break from religious topics. I know not all of my audience is that interested in this area of my stories. So next week, we go to college. I'll talk about my 9 semesters at IUPUI, earning a BS degree in computer science. And I'll probably follow that up with the 2 years I was employed as a computer programmer, starting my 8th semester in college. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. Still, every little bit helps. My deepest thanks, as always, to my financial supporters. Your support pays for the writing seminar I attend and other things. But most of all, it shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. Your support means more to me than words can express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear my stories. Even if you can't provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear my stories. All of my back episodes are available, and I encourage you to check them out if you're new to this podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find this podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.